On the morning of March 4th, 2019, a woman named Ellen Cross was found dead in her apartment in Portland, Oregon. Single gunshot wound. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The kind of crime scene that tells you everything and nothing at the same time. Detective Sarah Obi arrived at 7:14 a.m. She had been doing this for 22 years. She had learned to read rooms the way other people read faces. This room told her one thing immediately. Whoever did this had been here before. They knew the layout. They knew where Ellen would be. They knew exactly how much time they had. The forensic team processed the scene through the morning and into the afternoon. At 3:47 p.m., a technician called Obi into the bedroom. They had lifted a partial fingerprint from the window frame. Obi submitted it to the database as standard procedure. The result came back in 4 hours. She read it 3 times before she picked up the phone. The print belonged to a man named Victor Hale. Victor Hale had died on September 12, 1999, 20 years ago. Victor Hale had been, in the autumn of 1999, a 44-year-old insurance investigator living in a suburb of Portland with his wife Carol and their teenage son Marcus. By every official account, he was unremarkable. He paid his taxes on time. He coached his son's soccer team. He had a clean record and a modest savings account, and a reputation among his neighbors as the kind of man who always waved when he backed out of the driveway. On September 12, 1999, Victor Hale drove his car off a bridge on Route 7 in the early hours of the morning. The car was recovered from the river. Victor Hale was not. His body was never found. The official ruling was accidental death. The case was closed within 3 months. His wife Carol collected the life insurance. His son Marcus grew up without a father, and for 20 years, nobody thought about Victor Hale very much at all. Until his fingerprint showed up at a murder scene 2 decades after his death. Detective Sarah Obi had a rule she had followed for 22 years. Never assume, never dismiss, start from the beginning every single time. She pulled the Victor Hale file on a Wednesday morning and spread it across her desk the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation. She read everything: the accident report, the river search documentation, the insurance claim, the death certificate issued on the basis of presumed death after the body was never recovered. She noticed 3 things that nobody had apparently noticed in 1999. First, the accident happened at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Victor Hale had no reason to be on Route 7 at that hour. His office was in the opposite direction. He had no family or friends in that part of the county. Second, his car had been found with the driver's window fully down in September, in the rain. Third, and this was the one that made Obi sit very still at her desk, Victor Hale had taken out an additional life insurance policy on himself exactly 30 days before his disappearance. The beneficiary was not his wife. It was a woman named Ellen Cross. Ellen Cross, the same woman found dead in her Portland apartment on the morning of March 4th, 2019. Obi pulled Ellen Cross's background and found what she expected and did not expect simultaneously. Ellen Cross was 61 years old at the time of her death. She had lived in Portland for over 30 years. She had worked as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized insurance company from 1987 until her retirement in 2015. The same insurance company where Victor Hale had worked for 11 years before his death in 1999. They had been colleagues, possibly more than colleagues. Ellen Cross had never married. She had no children. Her finances were unremarkable except for one detail. In October 1999, 1 month after Victor Hale's disappearance, Ellen Cross had deposited $240,000 into a private savings account. The deposit was made in cash. It was never explained in any document Obi could find. $240,000 in cash. 1 month after a man named Victor Hale drove his car off a bridge in the middle of the night and was never seen again. Obi leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Victor Hale had not died in 1999. Victor Hale had disappeared in 1999, and those were 2 very different things. The question that kept Obi awake for the next 2 nights was simple. If Victor Hale was alive, where had he been for 20 years? And if he had killed Ellen Cross, why? She started with what she knew. Ellen Cross had received a substantial cash payment shortly after Victor's disappearance. This suggested she had helped him fake his death, helped him disappear, which meant she had known he was alive for 20 years, which meant she had kept that secret for 20 years. And then someone had come to her apartment and made sure she would never tell it. Obie requested a search warrant for Ellen Cross's apartment and personal records. What her team found there answered some questions and created several more. In a locked drawer in Ellen's bedroom desk, they found 19 years of letters, handwritten, no return address, postmarked from 17 different cities across 6 different states. The handwriting on every single one was identical, and at the bottom of every letter, the same signature. Not Victor, not a name at all. Just the letter V. The letters painted a picture that Obie had not expected. Victor Hale had not disappeared because he was guilty of something. He had disappeared because he had discovered something. In the letters, written over 19 years from cities as far apart as Tucson and Burlington. Victor described in careful detail what he had found in the autumn of 1999 while working as an insurance investigator. A pattern of fraudulent claims being processed through their company, millions of dollars, routed through shell accounts to individuals Victor had eventually identified as connected to organized crime. He had taken his findings to his supervisor. His supervisor had told him to forget what he had seen. 3 days later, 2 men had come to his house while Carol and Marcus were at school. They had not threatened him directly. They had simply sat in his living room and described in detail what his son's daily schedule looked like. Victor Hale had understood the message completely. He had called Ellen Cross that night, his most trusted colleague, his closest friend, and together they had built the only exit he could think of: a bridge, a car, a river, and a man who simply ceased to exist. Obie now had a direction. She pulled the original fraud investigation Victor had been working on in 1999 through a series of records requests that took 11 days to process. What she found had been buried carefully, but not carefully enough. The supervisor Victor had reported to in 1999 was a man named Douglas Farr. Douglas Farr had retired from the company in 2004 with a substantial pension and had died of a heart attack in 2011. But 2 of the names in the shell account network Victor had identified in his letters were still very much alive. One of them had served 2 terms on the Portland City Council. The other ran a private security firm with contracts across 3 states. Obie sat with this information for a long time. These were not small people. These were not people who would respond well to being investigated by a single homicide detective with a cold case file and a set of letters found in a dead woman's drawer. She called her captain at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night. She said 2 things. I need federal involvement on this case. And I think Victor Hale is still alive. And I think he's very close. Because the fingerprint on that window frame was not old. It was fresh. Or Victor Hale had been in that apartment within the last 48 hours of Ellen Cross's death. He hadn't killed her. He had come to warn her. And he had arrived too late. The FBI became formally involved in the case on a Monday morning. Obie was assigned a federal partner, a quiet agent named Torres, who had worked financial crime for 16 years and had the kind of patience that makes other investigators uncomfortable. Together they worked backward through Victor Hale's 19 years of movement. The postmarks on the letters created a partial map: Tucson, Burlington, Boise, Memphis, Nashville, Albuquerque, 17 cities in 19 years. Never staying anywhere longer than 14 months, always paying cash, always working jobs that didn't require a social security number, construction, farm labor, seasonal work that disappears when the season ends, and always moving before anyone could look at him too closely. His son Marcus, now 34 years old, had grown up believing his father had died accidentally when Marcus was 15. Obie visited Marcus on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat across from him in his kitchen and told him, as carefully as she could, that his father was likely still alive. Marcus Hale was silent for a very long time. Then he said something that Obie had not expected. I know, he said quietly. He called me 3 days ago. He told me to be careful. He told me they had found Ellen. And he told me he was coming home. Victor Hale walked into the FBI field office in Portland, Oregon on a Thursday morning in April 2019. He was 64 years old, thin, gray. The kind of tired that lives in a person's eyes, rather than their face. He had been traveling for 6 days from a small town in New Mexico, where he had been living under the name Paul Brennan for the past 3 years. He sat down across from Obi and Torres and placed a USB drive on the table. On it was everything, not just the letters, not just his memory of what he had seen in 1999. For 19 years, Victor Hale had been collecting every piece of documentation he could access remotely, every public record that connected the names he knew to the money he had traced, every thread of a financial network that had been operating quietly for over 2 decades. He had built a case from the inside of a disappearance. He said he had always intended to come back one day. He had just needed enough to make sure they couldn't make him disappear again. Ellen Cross's murder had changed his timeline. He had not been able to warn her in time. That was the thing he said he would never forgive himself for. He had called her. She hadn't answered. He had gone to her apartment. He had been 40 minutes too late. He had stood at her window and understood that 20 years of running had just run out. So he had stopped running. The 2 men Victor Hale had named in his documentation were arrested in June 2019. The city council member was taken into custody at his office on a Tuesday morning. The security firm owner was arrested at his home before dawn on the same day. The financial network Victor had traced turned out to be significantly larger than even he had known, spanning 4 states and involving 11 individuals in various positions of authority. The federal investigation that followed lasted 2 years. Victor Hale testified in a sealed proceeding in the spring of 2020. He was granted full immunity in exchange for his cooperation and his 19 years of documentation. The murder of Ellen Cross was ultimately attributed to a man employed by the security firm, a former law enforcement officer who had been with the network since its earliest days. He was convicted in 2021 and sentenced to life. Victor Hale did not return to his former life. That life, the suburb, the driveway, the soccer coaching, the man who always waved, had belonged to someone who no longer existed. But he did something nobody had expected him to do. He asked to see his son. Marcus Hale drove to Portland on a Saturday morning in July 2019 and met his father for the first time in 20 years in a small conference room in the FBI field office. Detective Obi was not in the room. She waited in the hallway. She said later that she could hear very little through the door, but she heard enough. A father's voice, a son's silence. And then, after a long time, the sound of 2 people deciding that 20 years was not the end of something. It was just a very long pause.